In a quiet suburban supermarket, a heated confrontation leaves a struggling single mother humiliated until the most unexpected person steps in. When Tom Hanks and a courageous bystander challenge a rude clerk's shocking behavior, the ripple effects change lives in ways no one saw coming. How far can kindness and courage go to spark change? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire action. The supermarket buzzed with life, aisles filled with the chatter of families and the hum of shopping carts gliding across polished floors. Brian Carter, a man who preferred the quiet over chaos, navigated the scene with practiced ease. At 38, he exuded a calm and steady presence, his dark eyes taking in his surroundings as he examined a list on his phone. He wasn't in a hurry. The trip was a routine errand, a pause from his work as a community organizer. As he turned the corner to the checkout lanes, his attention was drawn to a commotion near the front of the store. A woman's voice, trembling yet resolute, carried above the din. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said, holding out a stack of neatly clipped coupons. Her name tag read Susan, and her tired eyes betrayed the strain of someone just trying to make ends meet. "These are valid. Check the dates. I've used them here before." The clerk, a wiry man in his late 50s with a perpetual scowl, crossed his arms and sneered. His name tag announced him as Ted. "Lady, you're holding up the line. I don't have time to sort through all this junk. Pay for your groceries or leave." A murmur rippled through the small crowd forming behind Susan, a mix of annoyance and discomfort. No one stepped forward, though. They just watched, some with curiosity, others with impatience. Brian stopped a few feet away, his grip tightening on his shopping basket. He wasn't a stranger to scenes like this. He'd spent years advocating for people who faced mistreatment, but it didn't make witnessing it any easier. His heart sank as Susan's face flushed with embarrassment, her hands shaking as she tried to explain herself. "These coupons help me afford groceries," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm a single mom. I just need a little help." Ted scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "Everyone's got a sob story. Rules are rules." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Brian felt his pulse quicken. He glanced at the other customers, searching for a sign that someone else might step in, but most avoided eye contact, their attention glued to their carts or their phones. The silence felt like a verdict, and it wasn't in Susan's favor. Before Brian could move, another voice cut through the tension, a voice with a warmth and authority that demanded attention. "Excuse me, but is this really necessary?" The crowd turned as one, revealing a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses standing a few feet behind Brian. He held a basket with a few modest items: bread, milk, some fruit, but there was something unmistakable about him. Even in his casual attire, there was an aura of familiarity that tugged at the edges of recognition. Ted turned to the man, irritation flashing across his face. "Look, buddy, mind your own business. She's wasting everyone's time." The man removed his sunglasses, revealing kind, crinkled eyes. The room seemed to shift as gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Brian blinked in disbelief. He'd seen that face 100 times on movie posters, TV screens, and magazine covers. It was Tom Hanks. Susan, still clutching her coupons, looked between Ted and Tom, confusion mingling with faint hope. Tom stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "I think what she's doing is trying to pay for her groceries. That doesn't seem like something worth yelling about, does it?" Ted faltered, the bravado in his stance wilting. Well, it's against policy too." "Policy doesn't justify being rude," Tom interjected, his tone softening but losing none of its weight. He turned to Susan, offering her a gentle smile. "Ma, would you like me to help you with this?" Tears welled in Susan's eyes, and she nodded, unable to speak. The crowd began to stir, whispers growing louder as people realized who they were watching. Brian stepped forward, his resolve solidifying. "Ted," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, "if you need help verifying the coupons, I'm sure someone here can assist. But there's no reason to make her feel small." Ted's face reddened, the weight of the crowd's judgment bearing down on him. For a moment he seemed on the verge of retorting, but then his shoulders slumped. He snatched the coupons from Susan's hand and began scanning them, muttering under his breath. Tom turned to Brian, a small smile of acknowledgement passing between them. The air in the store shifted, tension giving way to a sense of collective relief. Brian couldn't help but wonder how many scenes like this played out every day, unnoticed and unresolved. As Ted grudgingly finished scanning the last coupon, Susan whispered a heartfelt thank you to both Tom and Brian. Brian nodded, but his mind was already turning. This wasn't over, not for Ted, not for Susan, and certainly not for the silent crowd that had witnessed it all. The story was only beginning. Ted slammed the cash register drawer shut, the metallic clang punctuating the lingering tension. He glared at Susan as though she were a personal affront to his existence, his lips curling in disdain. There he snapped. Happy now? You've wasted everyone's time. Susan flinched but kept her head down, quickly gathering her groceries. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, their unease palpable, but still, no one else intervened. Brian stayed rooted, his expression calm but his chest tight with frustration. He had seen this before, the unchecked power of a person in authority lashing out simply because they could. It never failed to anger him. But today was different. Today someone else was watching, and that someone wasn't just another bystander. Tom Hanks stepped forward again, his face unreadable yet commanding respect. Ted, is that how you treat all your customers, or is today just a bad day? Ted's mouth opened, then closed, his words caught in his throat as he registered the weight of the man addressing him. The crowd's whispers swelled, a few phones discreetly raised to capture the scene. It was clear now that they weren't just witnessing an ordinary altercation, they were watching a moment that could go viral. Ted squared his shoulders, trying to salvage his authority. I don't need a lecture from some celebrity about how to do my job, he spat, the venom in his voice cutting through the supermarket's hum. This is my store, and I make sure people follow the rules. Tom tilted his head, a hint of incredulity flickering in his expression. Your store, his voice carried no malice, but the question hung heavy in the air. Brian stepped closer, sensing the clerk's bravado wavering. Ted, he said evenly, we get that you have a job to do, but there's a way to enforce policy without belittling people. I don't need advice from you either, Ted shot back, his gaze flickering between Tom and Brian. His voice rose, laced with defensiveness. You people think you can walk in here, break all the rules, and I'm supposed to just smile and take it. The phrase "you people" hung in the air, cutting sharper than anything he'd said before. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. Brian's jaw tightened, and even Susan, who had been quietly bagging her groceries, froze mid-motion. Tom's calm demeanor shifted, a subtle hardness edging into his voice. Ted, I don't know what you mean by you people, but I'd suggest you think very carefully before you say anything else. The tension hit its peak, the air thick and suffocating. Ted's face flushed crimson, his chest heaving as he grappled with the silent judgment of the crowd and the unflinching gaze of one of the world's most beloved actors. Finally, Ted muttered, fine. Whatever, he turned his back, busying himself with meaningless tasks behind the counter, effectively shutting himself off from the situation. Brian exhaled slowly, the adrenaline in his system refusing to subside. He turned to Susan, offering her a reassuring nod. You okay? He asked softly. Susan nodded, though her hands trembled as she finished packing the last of her groceries. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Both of you. I didn't know what to do. Before Brian could respond, Tom stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. You didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. The crowd, once hesitant and passive, began to stir. A woman near the front stepped forward, her phone still clutched in her hand. I can't believe he talked to you like that, she said, addressing Susan. It's disgusting. A man nearby nodded, crossing his arms. Someone needs to report him. That's not how you treat people. Others murmured their agreement, and slowly the mood in the store shifted. Where there had been silence, there was now solidarity. People who moments ago had averted their gazes were now speaking up, their voices rising in indignation. Ted, hearing the growing chorus of disapproval, turned around, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. If you don't like how I run things, you can shop somewhere else, he barked, his tone desperate. Tom shook his head, his voice carrying a quiet power. That's not the point, Ted. This isn't about policies or rules, it's about how we treat each other. You had a chance to make someone's day better, and you chose to do the opposite. Ted opened his mouth to retort but stopped when the store manager appeared, alerted by the commotion. A middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, she approached the scene with brisk strides, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Ted. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her tone sharp. The woman with the phone stepped forward. This man berated a customer for using coupons and made a scene, and he said something completely inappropriate. The manager's face darkened as she turned to Ted. "Is this true?" Ted stammered, his bravado crumbling. Look, I was just doing my job." The manager didn't buy it. "We'll talk in my office." "Now." As Ted trudged away, the crowd parted, their expressions a mix of triumph and disdain. The manager turned to Susan, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry for what happened. Your coupons are always welcome here." Susan nodded, her voice too choked to respond. Brian, standing next to her, felt a strange sense of relief but knew the real impact of this moment would unfold in the days to come. Tom glanced at Brian, a quiet understanding passing between them. The battle was over, but the fight against people like Ted wasn't. Not yet, not by a long shot. The supermarket hummed with a strange mix of tension and curiosity as Ted followed the manager toward the back office. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and some customers began discreetly recording their accounts of what had just happened. Susan, still shaken, gripped her shopping bags tightly, as if the act of holding on to something tangible would ground her. "Do you need help to your car?" Brian asked, stepping toward her. His voice was calm but carried a weight of concern. Before Susan could answer, Tom Hanks placed his sunglasses back on and addressed her directly. "He's right, you've been through enough today. Let's make sure you get to your car safely." Susan blinked in surprise, a faint smile tugging at her lips, despite the day's events. "I think I'd feel better if you both came with me," she admitted, glancing between Brian and Tom. As the three began to walk toward the exit, the onlookers parted, their expressions ranging from admiration to quiet introspection. A few murmured words of thanks and encouragement followed them, a stark contrast to the earlier silence. The parking lot was alive with late-afternoon activity cars weaving in and out of spaces, the occasional cart rattling over uneven pavement. But for Brian, Susan, and Tom, the world seemed quieter, their steps falling into an unspoken rhythm. As they approached Susan's modest sedan, she finally exhaled, her shoulders loosening for the first time since the altercation began. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't spoken up." Brian waved off the thanks with a gentle smile. "You shouldn't have to go through something like that alone." Tom nodded in agreement, leaning casually against a nearby car. It's easy to stay quiet, to think it's someone else's responsibility to step in. But when you do that, people like Ted get away with it, and no one should have to deal with that kind of treatment. Susan hesitated, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. I try so hard to make things work. Raising 2 kids on my own isn't easy, and every little bit helps. Those coupons save me money I can put toward other things: school supplies, clothes, even just keeping the lights on." Brian felt a pang in his chest. He knew Susan's story wasn't unique, it was a reality faced by countless people, often dismissed or ignored. "You're doing what you need to for your family," he said. "That's nothing to be ashamed of." Susan smiled, the gratitude in her expression genuine. "It's not always easy, but moments like this remind me there are still good people out there." Tom gave her a warm nod. "We just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But honestly, you're stronger than you realize. Most people would have walked away after the way he spoke to you." Susan laughed softly, shaking her head. "I didn't feel strong back there, I felt small. Like I didn't belong." Brian opened his mouth to respond, but Tom beat him to it. "You belong wherever you decide to be," he said firmly. "Don't let people like him make you think otherwise." As Susan loaded her groceries into the car, the conversation took a lighter turn. Tom shared a humorous anecdote about filming a scene in a crowded supermarket for a movie, earning a genuine laugh from both Brian and Susan. The tension of the earlier incident seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of camaraderie. "Wait a minute," Susan said, her brow furrowing as she looked at Tom more closely. "I don't want to embarrass myself, but are you?" Tom grinned, holding up a hand to stop her. Yes, it's me, but today I'm just another guy trying to help. Susan's cheeks flushed. I knew you looked familiar. My kids love your movies. Brian chuckled. Well, they're going to think you're a superhero when you tell them who helped you with the groceries today. Tom shrugged playfully. I'll take it. Just don't tell them I didn't do much heavy lifting. As they finished, the store manager approached them, her expression solemn. I wanted to apologize again for what happened, she said, her tone sincere. We're taking this very seriously, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Brian nodded, his gaze steady. That's good to hear. But it's not just about today, it's about making sure everyone who walks into this store is treated with respect. The manager's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. You're absolutely right, and thank you for speaking up. Brian turned to Susan. Are you ready to head out? Susan glanced at her car, then back at her companions. I think so. Thank you again, both of you. Tom stepped forward, offering a quick handshake. It was our pleasure. Stay strong, Susan. You're doing great. As Susan drove away, Brian and Tom lingered in the parking lot for a moment, the weight of the afternoon settling over them. You didn't have to step in like that, Brian said after a pause. Tom shrugged, slipping his sunglasses back on. Neither did you. But we both know staying silent doesn't fix anything. Brian smiled, his respect for the actor deepening. I guess you're right. Small actions, big impact. Tom nodded, his voice quiet but resolute. Exactly. With that, they parted ways, two strangers united by a shared moment of courage and compassion. The automatic doors of the supermarket whooshed shut behind Susan as she drove away, leaving Brian and Tom standing in the parking lot. The crowd that had gathered inside had thinned, but the ripples of the incident lingered in the atmosphere. A few customers lingered outside, talking in hushed tones or stealing glances at the pair. The realization of Tom's identity was spreading, and it was clear people were beginning to piece together the gravity of what had just happened. Brian crossed his arms and turned to Tom. You know this is probably going to be all over the internet by tomorrow, right? Tom adjusted his sunglasses and gave a small, self-aware grin. Wouldn't be the first time, but if it gets people talking about what's right, I don't mind. Brian nodded, impressed by the actor's calm demeanor. Not many people in your position would have stepped in. They'd worry about the backlash. Tom chuckled softly, leaning against a nearby car. I've played too many roles as the good guy to not try and live up to it at least a little. But honestly, it's not about who I am, it's about what was happening. If people like us don't step up, who will? Brian was about to respond when the store manager exited the building, her steps purposeful as she approached them. Her expression was a mix of determination and unease, the weight of her role in the incident evident on her face. Mr. Hanks, Mr. Carter, she began, addressing them both respectfully. I want to thank you again for stepping in. Ted is not the easiest employee to manage, but his behavior today was unacceptable. I've spoken to him and we're taking immediate action. Brian raised an eyebrow. Immediate action. The manager hesitated, then sighed. Ted has been placed on suspension pending further review. He'll also be required to attend sensitivity training before he can return to work. Brian tilted his head, studying her carefully. And if he doesn't change, then he won't have a place here, the manager replied firmly. I know an apology won't fix what happened, but I want to assure you and Ms. Miller that this won't be swept under the rug. Tom stepped forward, his presence commanding but not overbearing. It's a start, he said. But it can't just be about Ted. What happened today is part of a bigger problem. How do you plan to make sure this doesn't happen again with someone else? The manager's lips pressed into a thin line. We're reviewing our policies and training programs. I've already contacted our HR team to ensure every employee understands how to treat customers with respect, regardless of their circumstances. Brian nodded, his expression softening slightly. That's the right direction. But it's not just about training, it's about creating a culture where people feel safe and valued. The manager's eyes flickered with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. I appreciate your input and your patience. This isn't going to be an overnight fix, but we're committed to doing better. As the manager returned inside, Brian and Tom exchanged a glance. "What do you think?" Tom asked. Brian sighed. "It's a step forward, but systemic change doesn't happen because of one incident. It's a long road." Tom nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "True, but every road starts with a step." Before Brian could respond, a young woman approached hesitantly, her phone clutched in her hand. "Excuse me," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thank you for what you both did back there." Tom gave her a warm smile. "You're welcome. But you could have spoken up too." The woman blushed, looking down at her shoes. "I know, I wanted to, but I was scared. I didn't know what to say." Brian stepped in, his tone gentle. "It's not always easy, but next time just remember that saying something, anything, can make a difference. Silence helps no one." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'll remember that. Thank you." As she walked away, Brian turned back to Tom. "You have a way of getting through to people." Tom shrugged. "Years of practice pretending to be someone who knows what to say. But you didn't hesitate for a second back there." Brian chuckled. "Let's just say it's not my first time dealing with a situation like that. But it's not every day I get backup from a Hollywood legend." Tom laughed, the sound lightening the mood. "Legend, huh? I'll take it." The two began walking toward their cars, the parking lot now almost empty. Brian paused before getting into his vehicle, looking at Tom thoughtfully. "This could have gone a lot differently if you hadn't been here." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Maybe. But I think you would have handled it just fine." Brian smiled. "Maybe. But together we made more of an impact. People saw us stand up, and maybe that'll make them think twice the next time they see something wrong." Tom extended his hand, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "Here's to more people standing up." Brian shook it firmly. "Here's to that." As they parted ways, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the parking lot. The day's events had left an indelible mark, not just on Susan, but on everyone who had witnessed it. Change wasn't guaranteed, but seeds had been planted. And sometimes that was all it took to start something bigger. The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Brian sat in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, reflecting on what had just unfolded. The adrenaline of the moment had faded, leaving behind a strange mix of satisfaction and weariness. His mind replayed the scene at the checkout, the anger, the injustice, the intervention, and he wondered how many more moments like it played out daily without anyone stepping in. A tap on his car window broke his thoughts. Turning, he saw Tom standing there, a bottle of water in one hand and an easy smile on his face. Brian rolled down the window. "Thought you might want this," Tom said, handing him the bottle. Brian took it with a grateful nod. "Thanks. Didn't realize how drained I was." Tom leaned against the car, his demeanor relaxed but thoughtful. "It takes a lot out of you, standing up in moments like that. It's not just about what you do, it's what it represents." Brian nodded, twisting the cap off the bottle. "Yeah, but it's worth it. Even if it's just one person, it's worth it." Tom studied him for a moment, then said, "You've done this before, haven't you?" Brian chuckled, a hint of weariness in his tone. "Too many times to count. The first work with a community organization, helping people navigate situations like this: discrimination, housing issues, systemic problems. Today was just another day." Tom's respect was evident as he nodded. "That's admirable, but I imagine it's exhausting too." Brian took a sip of water, then looked up at the actor. "It is. But if people like us don't step up, who will?" Tom laughed softly, echoing his earlier words. "You're right. That's exactly why I got involved back there. I couldn't just stand by." Brian gestured to the now quiet store. "You didn't just step in, you made an impact. People noticed. That kind of influence isn't something to take lightly." Tom shrugged, a modest smile playing on his lips. "I just hope it sticks. Moments like this are important, but they're not enough on their own." Inside the supermarket, the manager was still dealing with the aftermath. Ted sat in her office, his expression a mix of defiance and resignation. She stood across from him, her arms crossed. Ted, she began, her tone firm. I don't think you realize the gravity of what happened today. Your behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was unacceptable. Ted scoffed, leaning back in his chair. I was doing my job. She was wasting everyone's time. The manager's eyes narrowed. Your job is to serve customers, not to belittle them. And let's not forget what you said to Mr. Carter. You people, do you understand how offensive that is? Ted shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words finally sinking in. I didn't mean it like that, he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. The manager leaned forward, her tone softening but still firm. Intent doesn't erase impact. You've been with us a long time and I know you can do better. But if you want to stay here, you need to change. This isn't just about keeping your job, it's about being a better person. Ted was silent for a long moment, then gave a reluctant nod. I'll do the training, he said grudgingly. Good, she replied. Because this is your last chance. Outside, Brian and Tom continued their conversation, unaware of the scene unfolding in the manager's office. A few stragglers from the earlier crowd approached them hesitantly, one woman holding up her phone. Sorry to bother you, she said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. But I just wanted to say thank you for what you did in there. It was inspiring. Tom smiled warmly. I'm glad it meant something to you. The woman glanced at Brian. It meant something to all of us. You both showed what it means to stand up for what's right. Brian nodded, his voice steady. That's what we need, more of people willing to speak out. Don't wait for someone else to do it. The woman smiled, then held up her phone. Would it be okay if I shared what happened? I think people need to see this. Tom exchanged a glance with Brian, then nodded. If it helps get the message out, go for it. Just make sure the focus is on the issue, not the people involved. She nodded eagerly, thanking them again before walking away. Brian sighed, running a hand over his face. You realize this is going to go viral, right? Tom grinned. Probably. But if it gets people talking, maybe it'll do some good. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Brian and Tom finally parted ways, each carrying the weight of the day in their own way. Brian drove home, his mind already racing with ideas for how to use the moment as a teaching tool in his community work. Meanwhile, Tom slipped into his car, pulling his baseball cap lower as he prepared for the inevitable headlines. But despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, both men felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The incident at the supermarket was just one small moment in a much larger fight, but it was a moment that mattered. Sometimes all it took was one act of courage to spark change. The next morning, the story of the supermarket altercation had already started making waves. A grainy video, recorded by one of the onlookers, had been shared on multiple social media platforms. The clip showed Tom Hanks stepping in to defuse the situation and Brian Carter standing up to Ted with calm authority. The video's caption read, "When kindness and courage meet prejudice, a Hollywood legend and a local hero show us how it's done." By mid-morning, the video had gone viral. The hashtags "Stand Up for Kindness" and "Courage in Action" trended across platforms, sparking conversations about everyday prejudice and the power of speaking out. News outlets picked up the story, and the supermarket chain released a public statement apologizing for the incident, pledging to review their policies and improve employee training. Brian's phone buzzed incessantly with calls, messages, and notifications. Colleagues from his community organization, old friends, and even strangers reached out to commend him. He smiled at some of the messages but felt a twinge of unease. This wasn't about him, it was about the bigger picture. Later that afternoon, Brian found himself back at the supermarket. He hadn't planned on returning so soon, but the manager had called, requesting a meeting. As he entered, the atmosphere felt different. Employees greeted him warmly, and the few customers in the aisles nodded in recognition. The manager, Ms. Grant, met him at the front. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I wanted to apologize in person and give you an update." Brian shook her hand. "You don't need to apologize to me, but I appreciate it. How's Susan doing?" "She's doing well, Ms." Grant replied. "I called her this morning to check in. She seemed grateful for what you and Mr. Hanks did." "And Ted?" Brian asked, his tone measured. "Ms." Grant sighed. He's agreed to sensitivity training and has been placed on probation. I've made it clear that any further incidents will result in termination. I know it's not a perfect solution, but it's a start. Brian nodded. It's a good step. Just make sure the changes aren't temporary. These things have a way of fading unless you stay committed. MS Grant's expression softened. We're implementing mandatory training for all employees, not just Ted. And I'd like to invite you to speak to our team about creating a more inclusive environment. Brian raised an eyebrow. Me? She smiled. You made a difference yesterday. People listen to someone who leads by example. Brian considered it for a moment before nodding. I'd be happy to. Just let me know when. Across town, Susan was having a much quieter day. She sat at her kitchen table, sorting through bills while her 2 children played in the living room. Her phone chimed with notifications, friends and acquaintances sharing the viral video and sending her messages of support. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as a struggling single mother, but as a person whose dignity mattered. Her youngest, Ava, ran up to her holding a toy microphone. Mommy, are you famous now? Susan chuckled, pulling her daughter into her lap. No, sweetie, just lucky to have people who care. Ava tilted her head. Like the movie man. Yes, Susan said with a smile. And Mr. Brian. They reminded me that kindness matters. Meanwhile, Tom Hanks was trying to go about his day unnoticed. He had returned to his hotel, but the calls and texts from his publicist were relentless. Tom, this is huge, his publicist exclaimed over the phone. People love what you did yesterday. We need to leverage this. Tom sighed, leaning against the window. It's not about me, it's about what happened and what needs to change. I know, the publicist replied. But you can amplify that message. Use your platform to push for change. Tom considered this. He wasn't one to shy away from speaking out, but he wanted to ensure the focus remained on the issue, not his celebrity. Fine, he said finally. Let's craft a statement. Something that highlights the importance of standing up for others. A week later, Brian stood in front of the supermarket staff, speaking about the power of empathy and the importance of treating every person with respect. He shared stories from his work, drawing connections between systemic problems and everyday interactions like the one they had witnessed. The employees listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others jotting down notes. Ted sat in the back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But as Brian wrapped up, talking about the courage it takes to unlearn biases and be better, Ted's posture softened. After the meeting, he approached Brian hesitantly. I just wanted to say. I'm sorry, Ted said, his voice low. I didn't realize how I sounded until I saw myself through other people's eyes. Brian nodded. Acknowledging it is the first step. The real work is in changing. Ted extended his hand. I'll try. Thank you for not giving up on me. Brian shook his hand, hope flickering in his chest. That evening, Susan received a package at her door. Inside was a handwritten note on elegant stationery. Susan, you're stronger than you realize. Keep going and know that people are rooting for you. Tom. Tucked beneath the note was a gift card to the supermarket, enough to cover several weeks of groceries. Tears welled in her eyes as she read the note aloud to her children, feeling a renewed sense of hope. As the story began to fade from the headlines, the lessons it carried remained. People who had witnessed the incident or seen the video thought twice about their own actions. Conversations were sparked in homes, workplaces, and schools about prejudice, kindness, and the courage it takes to speak up. Brian, Susan, and even Ted carried the weight of that day with them, each changed in their own way. And as for Tom Hanks, he continued living up to the roles he played on screen not because he had to, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. Sometimes all it took was a moment of courage to create a ripple, and in those ripples the seeds of change were sown.